Okay, so for the first 5 classes, we've done the 30,000-foot themes of the book of Daniel. We've looked really at the earthly versus the spiritual kingdoms, and just contrasting that, looking at the various prophecies, looking at the history that led up to the book of Daniel, how Daniel got there, and as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We looked at the sins of Israel that led them as a nation to be in a position where God would send them into captivity, as well as the kingdoms that would happen afterwards that would eventually lead to the one eternal kingdom that we partake of as Christians right now. And so that's been the big picture view we've looked at. Now we move into a different phase of the class this quarter, which is to look at not the big picture, but the individuals within that big picture. What does it mean to have faith in a foreign land? This certainly is true for Daniel, that Daniel was physically a man who was ripped from his homeland and taken to a foreign land. But the book of Hebrews says that anybody who's going to live by faith has to consider themselves a stranger and a pilgrim in a foreign land. And that is the character trait of those who live for Christ, is that you are part of a kingdom that is not of this world, and so you don't live like this world, and everything is backwards. And it depends on how you think of it. When you're the world looking at Christians, the world thinks that Christians are backwards. The way that we live and the choices that we make seem totally backwards to the world. But then if you're a Christian and you're living in this world, it often feels like you're doing the same thing. You're saying everything is backwards. We often quote the Old Testament that says you call good evil and evil good. That's backwards. It's just we've gotten to where we see everything exactly different, and it's because it's a foreign land. And people who are living outside of Christ are speaking a foreign tongue, in a sense, a foreign moral tongue. They think about things differently than us. And to them, we're doing the same thing. I don't know if you've ever tried to converse with somebody who speaks another language. You can put in as much effort as you want, but you really don't get very far until you can find some sort of common ground. Typically, if you are trying to talk to somebody who speaks another language, you don't get far until you can kind of point to something, and then you say your word for that thing, and they say their word for that thing, and then you kind of found a common ground you can start with. I think in many ways that's what evangelism is for us, is to try and find that one common starting point and begin to teach them a foreign language. Christianity, before you're a Christian, is a foreign language. And you think about Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch, and here's a verse, and even though the Ethiopian eunuch was a good guy, what was his problem with the verse he was reading? He didn't understand it. And so it says, starting with that verse, Philip taught him Christ. And so that's it. We're looking for one kind of common theme, and that is kind of the journey, I think, a lot of times with evangelism. But as we look at what it means to live as people of faith in a foreign land, Daniel gives us a physical representation of that. He gives us an example of what is it like to live one way when everybody else is living another way. So there are 4 different major areas in which that happened. Each of them were given a separate class. So tonight we're going to look at the unclean foods that'll show up in Daniel chapter 1, as well as doing some introductory material just looking at Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well. By the way, I always feel just a slight twinge of guilt whenever I say Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because Daniel is his Hebrew name, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is their Babylonian name. And those poor guys we've just decided they go by the Babylonian name for one reason and one reason only. Let's be honest. It sounds cool to say. That's exactly right. It's easy to say it, right? So, but their names mean something. So if you have the handout for tonight, I do not have a bunch of slides tonight. We're just going to talk. We're just going to talk. I'm not going to just talk. It'll be a really boring class if I'm the only one who talks. But if you have the handout, the first page is just looking at the names, the Hebrew names, and then the Aramaic names for these men. So Daniel's name means God is my judge. So the Bible has a way of using names to emphasize ideas. We see it throughout the text, and probably, I would say, the strongest examples of that are in the New Testament. What did Jesus often do with people's names? He'd give them a new one. That's right, he'd give them a new one. He'd change their name. And so much so that when the apostles then were leading the church after Jesus had ascended, they did it at least on one occasion. They gave a guy a nickname. Pop quiz, who is it? Barnabas. That's right. Barnabas was the guy given the nickname. So names have a lot of emphasis in the Bible, and God has a way through His infinite wisdom and providence of putting names that seem to fit the situation and the circumstances. So you think about Daniel, and his name means God is my judge. How did that guy live? You care what Nebuchadnezzar thought about him? Or the Babylonian culture? And he just got up every morning and he says, God's my judge. Every day I'm going to get up and God's my judge, and that's what I'm going to deal with. If God's okay with me at the end of the day, I'm okay. If God is not okay with me at the end of the day, there's a problem. But who cares about the rest of it? And it worked pretty well for him. So that's his name. Hananiah means God is favored. So his name means God is favored. You can think about that as them living in that foreign land. Who gets the favor? Who gets the privilege and the attention, right? You're not supposed to do this, but if you had a favored child, they would be the child you gave extra attention to. Some of you turned to your parents right then, and I saw it, and it was like, it's me. But that's what, if you had a favored child, they would be the one that would say that they got an extra level of attention. Hananiah, his name means God is favored. Mishael, his name's the hardest one to translate. The translators have a little bit of difficulty with it. It either means just purely who is God, or it means who is what God is. Now, either one of those has pretty powerful connotation to it. Who is God? If you're in Babylon, you got a lot of choices, right? So who is God? That's the real important question. Who is God? If it is who is what God is, it gives kind of the same idea, but a slightly different twist, which is who's like God? That would be how we would say it. Who's like God? And of course, the answer there is nobody. Nobody's like God. Azariah is the last one, and his name means Jehovah has helped. You think about those three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I know I did it again, and it hurts my heart, but Jehovah has helped. Did they ever have circumstances where Jehovah helped them? So we'll see that eventually. Their Aramaic names, though, were given to them. So if you look in Daniel chapter 1, and then you go down to verse 7, it says, the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. So they're assigned these names. To Daniel, he is assigned the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now these names are Aramaic names. Just as kind of a point of interest, we get into chapter 2 at about verse 4. And the book of Daniel switches from Hebrew language that it's written into Aramaic that it's written in. Daniel chapter 2 verse 4 is where that starts. Just kind of a point of interest. So when they say the Bible is written in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, primarily it's the book of Daniel that you're looking at where that Aramaic comes in. That's not the only place, but it's one of the primary ones. Belteshazzar means Bel's prince. And Bel was a term for Babylonian gods. So you think this is a name that Babylon assigns to Daniel. And he says, this is a prince that belongs to the Babylonian gods. Does that name fit him? Not one whit, does it? Not at all. Shadrach means the great scribe. So that probably had more to do with the roles that they were going to hold in Babylon. Meshach means guest of the king. That king presumably would be Nebuchadnezzar that it's referencing. And you think about that for a second. When it says he's guest of the king, normally a guest voluntarily is allowed to come and go when they want, right? Not so with these guys. He's not. If you have guests and they show up because you made them and they're not allowed to leave, they're not guests anymore. And then the last one is Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, or it potentially means worshiper of Mercury. That's another translation. Servant of Nebo is, I think, probably the more likely of the two. But once again, you're looking at this language of serving the Babylonian Empire, serving the Babylonian gods. So the names that they're given reflect who Babylon wants them to be. We want you to be a prince of Bel, of the Babylonian gods. We want you to be a Babylonian scribe, a guest of the king, or a servant of Nebo. We want you to be doing those things. So the name assignment tells us something. Is there anything we can learn from that? Like as we think about just names, is there anything that we can learn from the fact that they were assigned these names? Oh, it's going to be a long class. I mean, that's an excellent point. Yeah, absolutely. We get to choose, right? We get to choose. They could have easily become the new names if they'd wanted to. I mean, that they would have had all the support in the world to be Babylonian. That's what they wanted. But they chose to be the other identity. They chose to stick with God. Yeah. Anybody else have something? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there is just a statement of power being made there, right? And as you said, that goes all the way back to Adam naming the animals. I mean, it's just the one with dominion names the ones below. So yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. So you have the Babylonian names that they're assigned are all about Babylon, its kingdom, its power, its dominion, and the focus is not on Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's on Nebuchadnezzar, right, and his kingdom. Whereas, as you said, their original names, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all have this reference to the relationship with God. And so there is kind of a statement about who's going to be the king, right? Who's going to be in charge. Anybody else have anything to add there? Okay, so might also add, they are all originally from the tribe of Judah. So all of these are, they came from Judah. And if you remember, this is the southern kingdom that is being taken into captivity. Northern kingdom, which was the other 10 tribes other than Judah, and what other tribe? You remember, it's Judah and who? Benjamin. Yeah, Judah and Benjamin. Okay, somebody said Simeon. Simeon's like the wild card. And I probably should clarify that. Technically, Simeon is kind of absorbed into Judah at one point. So there is some debate of like, is Simeon part of Judah at that point? Because if you look at maps, and I'm diverging a little bit, but I want to make sure I give an accurate answer to this, because somebody did say Simeon, and I don't know always who said what, so sorry, it's the mass. But if you're looking at a map, maybe like in the back of your Bible, sometimes you look down at the southern kingdom, or the division of the different tribes in the kingdom, and Simeon is fully within the boundaries of Judah. Has anybody ever noticed that before? That they're inside of Judah. If you go back to the original time when they conquered the land, when Judah went to conquer the land, they had a conversation with the tribe of Simeon and said, hey, this land is more than what we need. How about you come and join us? So there is some question as to whether they were kind of just absorbed into the land area of Judah by the time you get to captivity. So Judah and Benjamin are the two tribes that are mentioned. Simeon seems to be at least partially in there, but not as a recognized tribe at that point. Okay, so as we go to Daniel chapter 1, we looked at the names ahead of time. As we look at them, they are entering into Babylon. That's where Daniel chapter 1 starts us off with, is Babylon came to Jerusalem and it besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. So they have taken a lot of the vessels of the house of God, meaning the implements used in the temple. And it says then in verse 3, the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So in this just first couple of verses, we find out how Daniel and his friends end up there in Babylon. So if you remember back in the class when we talked about them heading into captivity, there were three phases of captivity. This is the first phase. It happened in 606 BC, and the people who were taken off were the royal family and the nobles. And at this point in the book of Daniel, we're given a little bit more detail that one of the reasons they were taken off, along with many of the gold and riches of Jerusalem, was so that these royal nobles could be trained in Babylonian ways and then become these ambassadors to go back and assimilate the rest of Israel. Because at this point, there's only been one phase of the captivity. Nebuchadnezzar is still not planning on totally destroying Jerusalem and taking all of Israel captive. His goal is to find a way to get them to settle down and just accept Babylon, which of course they won't eventually do, right? That won't happen. But he doesn't know that because he can't tell the future. So his goal is to do what he did with many, many other nations, which is, we'll take your royalty away. And if you do that, if you take the royalty of a kingdom away, what happens immediately the moment you do that? Okay, that's fair. If people don't like them, they might be happy. But you do have a power vacuum, right? And it's the same. That is the reason why whenever the State of the Union happens, what's the one security precaution they take? Everybody know? That's right. So one person who's in line to be president is kept out of the State of the Union. There's always one person in that line. In case something really bad happened, we'd still have somebody who could step up and be president. And it's a safety precaution because we understand in America, if you lose everybody in the government, though there may be some rejoicing, there would also be an awful lot of chaos. So that's what he does. He just makes this power vacuum, but then he takes those royals and he takes the young ones. Now, why would you take the young ones of the royalty and train them? Why not the old ones? Okay, so one is just simple, they don't know any better yet. So that's one. What would be another reason? They're moldable. Yeah, they're moldable. Young minds are the most capable of accepting change. Is that a fair way to put it? We have sayings like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? So then you have these young ones, you mold them in the ways of Babylon, and then his plan is they can then go back and they're going to be that bridge. Come join Babylon, quit arguing, quit fighting, and, accept us. That's the goal originally. Right. Yep, that's right. I could have crushed you, but instead I welcomed you into my kingdom. Right? So, yeah, exactly. So there's some PR moves in the whole deal too. Now, it doesn't work out that way because of the fact that Israel will continue to rebel, and then eventually Babylon will say, that's it, we've had enough, and wipe them out, destroy Jerusalem, and it's all done. But this is the beginning of that story when all of this is happening. Now, the character traits, there are 5 distinct character traits that I counted. Maybe somebody else can count some other ones. But the 5 traits that all 4 of these men have, based off of just the first 3 or 4 verses there, are what? What are the 5 traits we're given of them? They're good looking. That's right. So Daniel's a good looking guy. Without blemish. Yeah, no defect in him. Yeah, endowed with knowledge. They're intelligent. These are smart guys. Daniel is, head of the class. All of these guys are the smart ones. Competent. Yeah, competent. Yeah. They have the ability to serve. I think that's, who had ability for serving in the king's court. So that's competency. Yeah. Strong. I'm sorry, I missed just part of it. Physically strong. Yeah, they're young, they're in good shape, right? They're not, I don't know if they did a lifting competition or anything, but they're definitely going to be fitting in the category of young and able-bodied. And then the other one we mentioned right up front is they are nobles. They're of royal lineage. So when you think of Daniel, you have to put that in the context, right? You have to realize this is Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are all intelligent, they're competent, they're young, they're good-looking, they're nobility. Now think about that for a second. If you took somebody and you said they have been raised in a noble royal family, they're good-looking, intelligent, competent, what are the chances they turn out to be good people? I mean, let's be honest. When people start out and they've got money and they've got everything handed to them because they're part of the royal family, how well does that work out? It's normally a mess, isn't it? These guys are choosing who they're going to be every step of the way. I like what you said earlier where you get to choose your identity. They're choosing to not follow the statistics. They're not the silver spoon kids who turn out a mess. They're not, they don't just give in to the Babylonian way of thinking. But then, another thing for us to consider along the way, if you take Daniel chapter 1 verse 3 says that Ashpenaz was the chief of his officials. Some of your translations will say chief of his officials, but if you have a footnote there, it says chief officials is actually literally what? Anybody know? Eunuchs. Yeah, eunuchs. Chief of his eunuchs. That's the literal terminology there. If you take that as well as what's said in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 18 about what would happen to the royal family who was taken off into Babylon, it is quite likely that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were all made eunuchs. So that would have been an abrupt change of their life. I mean, to not get too much into the subject, but, you know, we never read about Daniel having a wife or anything like that. And we do not know that for sure, but there is good evidence to point that direction. In fact, even Josephus, when he talks about Daniel, refers to him as a eunuch. Now, that doesn't mean it's true. Josephus is a extra biblical source, so it's not a guarantee, but we have several things in the text that point towards them being made eunuchs. And we also know in Matthew 19:12, Jesus says there's 3 reasons that people don't get married. And one of them is they're made eunuchs by men, which is a practice that has existed across the world for ages. The Ethiopian eunuch most likely was made a eunuch by men because he was working very closely with who? The wife, Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians. So that is not an uncommon practice, and it may very well have been the case for these men. So what I'm trying to do is paint for you a picture of how much their life changed like that. Everything is taken away from them. And at this stage of their life, they enter in as 18, 19, 20-year-olds into Babylon. What has Israel done for them as a nation? What good has Israel done? Can you tell me one good thing? None. It's really nothing, right? So Jehovah is the God of Israel. How easy would it be for them to just simply say, you know what? Israel's been bad to us, and we've had nothing but bad luck, and now we show up in Babylon, and this guy's offering to teach us and give us an education and give us nice food and all these sorts of things. Let's just switch teams. You see the temptation? It would have been very easy. We often think about them by the time they get to the bowing down to the statue stage. But I think if you back up, the point where those guys had to really make a decision who they were going to serve, it started on their march to Babylon. Who are we going to be when we get to the other side? Who are we going to be when we settle in there? So they get there, and now they are going to be educated. Down in verse 5, it tells us they're going to be educated for 3 years. They're going to get a high-level education. And while they're being educated, the king is going to make sure that they have the best of everything. Right? So verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. So here, they're going to enter into the king's personal service eventually, but right now, their job is to study. And while they're studying, they're going to get the best of everything. And that's the whole job of this chief official, Ashpenaz, is to make sure all of that happens. Right? Make sure all these guys are taken care of. They're getting their education. They're going to work for me. I don't want them hungry. I want them good and fat and happy. Well, when they enter into this service, like in our mind's eye, what are they leaving when they, here they come in and they're going to be appointed rations and a place to stay and probably new clothes and all sorts of things. They're going to have teachers and education. They're entering into that. What are they leaving? Where were they 24 hours before with all the other royalty? they would probably been in some form of chains or bondage, right? Not every royal and noble gets this job. We just talked about all the different traits that they have. They weren't all good looking, right? They weren't all intelligent. So all the ones who do not meet the qualifications of being young and good looking and competent and intelligent, all of them, they are at best in captivity, at worst dead. So now they're getting their first chance at life. Like, this is their big break, right? It's like winning the lottery. Everybody else is having all these bad things happen to them, but they've got a shot. Now, all you have to do to get your big break is accept the king's choice food, the good food, the bacon. He offers you bacon. All you have to do is be okay with that. What's the problem? It's unclean. Now, there's potentially 3 reasons that it was unclean. I think the most likely, and by the way, these 3 different likely reasons, it may have been more than one of them that was the likely reason. The most straightforward one, I think, is just simply that the king's choice food, because we're never told exactly what the king's choice food was. I joke that it's bacon, but we don't know what it is. It would be my choice food if I were king. But the most likely is just simply prohibited by Jewish food laws. Right? You can go to places like Leviticus 11, Leviticus 17. It talks about the various animals you could and could not eat. That's the most likely. But to be fair, one of the other things it says is they would not defile themselves in verse 8 with the king's choice food, or in verse 8, what else did they say they wouldn't defile themselves with? Wine. Yeah, it's an open book test. It's an open book test. Yeah, the king's choice food or with wine. Well, wine is not an unclean food. So, this brings up another question, because they wouldn't defile themselves with that. There are 2 other potential reasons that things were unclean. One of them was the fact that maybe they'd taken a Nazirite vow. We do not know that. And I don't want you to walk away saying Scott said that they took a Nazirite vow. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if they did take a Nazirite vow, that would be one case in which they were prohibited from having any sort of wine. Think of Samson. He was a Nazirite, not allowed to. The other is, a lot of the king's choice things would likely have been associated with idolatry and sacrifice to the false gods first. And they would have known it, right? And it's a very common thing, especially if you're the king. You go and make all these sacrifices to your gods, and then that meat and wine and whatever gets used in your royal feasting. So it could be any of those 3 things, or it could be all 3 of those things, or it could be 2 of those 3 things. But for whatever of those reasons, they make a decision that if they have this, they will be defiling themselves. And verse 8 tells you everything you need to know in the first 6 words. But Daniel made up his mind. Everything else is an extension of that. All the other stuff he's going to do, how they handle this conflict, all begins with Daniel made up his mind. Some translations say Daniel purposed in his heart, and I love that one better. It's not a, both are proper translations, but sometimes, you know how it is, sometimes you just read a certain translation, it just feels right. Daniel purposed in his heart, I feel like that hits the tone of it, doesn't it? Because it's not just a head thing. We've all had things that we know we should do up here, but then we did that stupid thing. It only stops you when you get it here, and you also get it here. Daniel didn't just purpose. He knew in his mind it would defile him, but he knew in his heart, I will not be defiled. Those two things have to combine together. And so, at some point, Daniel, as well as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, made up their mind, we will not. Now, where's the caveat to that? We will not defile ourselves. Like, where's the if? We will not defile ourselves unless, or except, or only if. Where's the caveat? There isn't any. Got a lot of people shaking their heads. There isn't any. And that's a really important point, isn't it? Because if there is a clause, if there is a caveat, have you really purposed in your heart? That's the problem, right? A lot of times, what we do in life is we say, I would never do that. But in the back of our head, unless. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So anything that was done to them, defiling that was done to them, was done to violation.
Right.
This is their first opportune time to choose. They're saying, eat this, and they're like, no, I don't have to. Of course, they don't have to. But what do we find if they don't please them?
Mm-hmm.
Their lives are forfeit.
Right.
But this is a choice, and they're making that choice, even if it means the end of their life. They don't know at this point, but that's a big choice right there. I mean, yes, you could have a good life here, could be comfortable, but now we have a choice.
Yeah, because it really is. I mean, this is the first good thing to happen to them in a while, right? You won the lotto. You're the big winners. We like you. You're going to get to be in the king's personal service. Everything's great. Except you're going to have to do something you just know is wrong. But here's the thing. How easy would it be to rationalize that that was not that big of a deal? And Kyle says it's a choice, but couldn't I rationalize that it's not a choice? It's like, this is the food they gave me. What do you expect me to do? Starve? I could see myself making that rationalization really fast. I didn't sit here and think about that for a long time to come up with that, by the way. I just thought of that right now. That's how good I am at rationalizing whatever I want to do. I have no choice. What am I going to do? Starve myself? Die? I know what happened to everybody else. Maybe God is giving this to me as a chance. God's gracious, by the way. Isn't God gracious? He's not going to hold something against me I don't have a choice in. The rationalization? Anybody else have some rationalization they want to share? Some things you could tell yourself? Did you have something? Nope. Okay. That's how you know somebody doesn't have something, is when they look like, please tell me it was pointing to somebody behind me. Yeah. You can think of a lot of reasons that you would just accept it. And then on top of it, if they do the wrong thing, who's going to call them on it? I mean, there's no watchdog, right? It's just those four guys. This is exactly why Jesus says, when you do your righteous deeds to be seen by men, you receive your reward in full. But when you go and pray in your inner room, when nobody knows, there's only God who can reward you. This is an inner room moment. And it only happens if they move from not just intellectually knowing, but the heart too. And so, Daniel purposes his heart. Then what's the next thing he does? Yeah, he asks for an exception. He has a conversation, right? It's a conflict conversation, but he has it nicely, right? So he has a kind but firm explanation that he gives for why he's going to do what he's going to do. He does not come with, this mean, I'm so much better than you, holier than thou mentality. He just simply says, as he talks, he says he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He sought an exception. And one of the things that I think we'll find as we look at these men, as they are showing faith all the way through, is that they are pretty unassuming. I think probably the strongest example of that is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before Nebuchadnezzar when he tells them to bow down. And they're just very forthright about it. We're not going to do it. We don't have to answer you. If you're going to kill us, kill us. If our God saves us, great. If not, I'm still not going to change my mind. Like, you don't see anger and finger pointing or anything like that. Just, this is how it is. I think that's a characteristic of living a life of faith in a foreign land, is you have to understand they're not going to get why it's important to you, so you just got to lay out, this is important to me. And then, maybe they give you an exception, maybe they don't. In this case, he does. They offer solutions because he has the commander has a problem. What's the problem? What's his concern? Yeah, he's going to get it. That's right. His concern is, you guys are going to wither away, you're not going to be fat and happy, and I'm going to be in trouble. And so they offer a solution. Here, do this for a while, and we'll see how it goes. And then from there, verse 12 tells us, what they said is, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. There is a trust that if they do it God's way, it'll work out. And I love that. Because they don't know that they're going to be fat and happy on the other side of this. I don't know about you, but if I offered a solution of, I won't eat bacon, I'll only eat vegetables, I would not expect to be fat and happy on the other side. But it worked out. It all worked out. You just do it. One act of faith that we have is just simply say, if we do it God's way, even though we may not see the path of how it will work out, we trust God to resolve it. So really, those are the four conflict resolution things that they have. They purpose in their hearts. They give a kind but firm explanation. Well, like, we're not moving on this, but we don't have to be mean about it. They offer solutions. I can't do this, but I can do this. And then they trust God to work it out. And if you and I did that with every single circumstance where our life of faith came in conflict with the world around us, I think we'd find ourselves to be doing pretty well. I wish I did that every time. But it gives us a good model from these men, and of course, it does work out. I'm realizing I am at time. Does anybody else have any comments or questions as we close out class? Okay, then Matt, do you mind leading us in a closing prayer? Any announcements from the elders?